Welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon, and I'm the host of a Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present, and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs.
Welcome to this podcast. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present, and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. Welcome newcomers. We love hearing from you and the diverse reasons why you're joining our group. A recent comment was, I listened to the podcast on thinking about reading and it was really helpful as I'm about to start literature circles in my class next week. And that's exactly the type of questions we are giving the girls to think about before reading. So thanks very much for that person who gave us that feedback. That was great. Please join our Teachers Toolkit Facebook group and keep up to date, as well as watch out for our newsletters. And folks, welcome to this podcast, Tips and Tools for Supporting Early Learners with Diane Snowball. The session was actually a recent Zoom Q&A session with a group of F2 teachers at a school in Victoria. The teachers asked Diane a series of questions related to spelling and word work, but the conversation expanded into other areas of literacy, so Diane could give the context for the teaching work. So enjoy this episode, and Diane will finish the session today. We look forward to you joining our next podcast. Please keep up to date through the Q Learning website. Bye for now.
Well, first of all, when you think about letters, there's a few things that you're teaching your kids about letters, things you want them to learn. One, you want them to know the letter name so that when they see it, they will be able to name it. That's its label. And that the reason why that's important is because it allows us to have a discussion about the letter by being able to name it. If it didn't have a name, we'd be, I don't know, how could we say the da-da-da in this word is at the beginning of the word, or, what you've got to name whatever you're talking about. So that's why we have the letter name. And of course, there's just 26 names, and they can look in two different ways, can't they? They can look like the capital letter or the lowercase letter. So the kids have to be able to recognise both upper and lowercase and be able to name them. And we'll come back and talk about how you help them do that after we think about what they need to learn. They also need to learn how to write them, don't they? That's the handwriting part of it. And to write them fluidly and legibly. And that's the whole reason why Victoria, many, many years ago, did so much research about what that should look like and how it should happen and what size it should be, etc. And it really was a 5-year world research project that they came up with those letters looking like they do today, so that when the children then transferred to joined writing, it would be easy to do. In comparison with when I went to school, we learned to print, and then in grade 3 we had to learn a whole new thing because we were now going to join our letters. And so it was like learning all over again. So that's why the letters are written today the way they are. And it's purposely so that it can be easy to join. The other thing is the way they used to be written, B's, P's, D's and Q's were exactly the same as each other, just turned around. And they're not like that now, are they? So they hope that would help kids. But, the interesting thing is, I don't know if you've noticed that the books that the children read are going to have all kinds of what they call fonts in them. When they're reading anything in books or in the environment, they're actually going to see those letters written lots of different ways, aren't they? And they're called different fonts. So they don't necessarily see letters to read in the same way that they're learning the handwriting of them. And I can remember when a person called Des Ryan did a huge amount of research about whether that affected children's reading or not many years ago, and it was found that it didn't. So we're really teaching the handwriting for writing purposes. It's not like that's the only way they're going to recognise what the letter looks like. And, you know, publishers who are publishing children's books will purposely try to use fonts where, you know, the A actually looks like an A and not with that extra curled bit on top, you know what I mean? Or a G that's got all sorts of extra things under it. But the fascinating thing is that when those letters are actually all joined together in a word, the children still recognise the word, even if the publishers used all sorts of funny scripts. But they mostly try to use very plain scripts. Now, I'm going to tell you something on the side here why you should never get worried about, and I guess what I'll do is I'll write it, but, you know, you can write an A in a book. Might look like this, or it may look like that. Can you see both of those?
Yeah.
Am I holding it in the right place?
Yeah.
Okay. And that doesn't worry the kids, and it's fascinating to me that they can still recognise it. It's because they're not seeing it as an A, they're seeing it in a word. But publishers who are publishing for us, for our age group, something that's just a plain letter like that is referred to as a Sanskrit. It doesn't have any little curls added to it. That's SANS. But people who design print actually know it's easier to read if letters have little things added to them. So, I mean, it's a very interesting thing to me. When I was involved in the publishing of children's books, we used to have to think a lot about it, particularly what sort of letters we were using in big books for shared reading. But I'm only just giving you all this as background information because some people sort of think, oh, if the letters in a book are written differently than how we learn to write them, that's going to affect their reading, and it doesn't. Okay, so it's as simple as that, not something you need to worry about. So we need to learn their names. We need to know what they look like, and we need to be able to learn how to write them. Now, there's the whole business then of sounds, and for every letter in the English alphabet, the 26 of them, all of them can actually be said different ways, many ways more than others, all right? So you might say, oh, the letter B will always be a B. Well, actually, in a word like comb, C-O-M-B, it's not even pronounced, all right? So you can't ever say, oh, B says B, and think you're telling children the truth. You're only telling them part of the truth because it really is. And by the way, they don't say anything. So the letter B can represent many sounds, and it can represent the B sound, but also if we see it in some words, perhaps it won't even be pronounced. Now that's me telling the children the truth, isn't it? Yeah. It is not the truth to say C says K, right? Because it only does in some words. And if your name's Cyril or Cecily or something, then you're actually very confused by that teacher's statement because you know in your name that's not how the letter C is pronounced. So you don't make statements that are not the truth of the language. Ultimately, and I've found over my years, the kids who are most confused by those statements are the ones who are finding reading the most struggling, right? So we actually need to be very clear about the statements we make. And I want you to always think about a letter name is something you can say. The name of the letter is C. The sounds it can represent are K, ch when it's with an H, S when it's in a word like Cecily, and in circus, it might be representing two different sounds, S at the beginning, K in the middle. So I don't have to make anything up. I can just talk about it as it actually is. And because even in the high frequency words, even in 3-letter words, you can have things that if you've said the letter S and it's a letter, it has a name, it could be representing the sound. But what about the word was? Is it representing the sound in the word was? No. And yet that's a very common word that children are going to find in whatever they're reading. And of course, they're going to write it. What do they do when they write it? When they're beginning writers, they write W, and what do they put in the middle? Was, O, all right? So they're trying to hear the sounds in words and represent them, and they're going to represent what they think they might be. And until they've actually seen the word enough times, they won't even know that it could be something else. But, you know, if you tell them lies, you're going to make it harder. So I think part of your question to me was, is it all right to say, you know, something like C says Kurt, because it most often is? Well, you know, you're not sure about that, are you? How do you know that C says Kurt more often than S? Have you actually ever studied that? Ever done an analysis of all the words in the English language to discover whether that statement's true or not?
No, we haven't.
All right. So, and you don't need to make such statements. What you would do, though, is, and I always say to kids, look, I've noticed in your writing that some words that you're doing a really great job, you're trying to spell words you don't know yet, and you really do have to keep praising them, don't you? Because some kids, and they'll actually take a dive sometimes as they start to read more, and they think, oh, I don't know how to spell that. And they just sort of almost stop their writing because they're aware now that they don't know how to spell the word correctly. So they think that means they can't write it. So you do have to keep encouraging them by how really good it is that they're trying unknown words, and, you know, they're nearly right and they've got this part right and what they're doing makes sense. But, you know, and because you are experimenting with ways to represent words that have a k sound in them, let's study that sound and find out the different ways it could be represented. And that's where it's so important that you've been doing a lot of shared reading, even if it's from poems and rhymes and songs and a few shared reading books. You've got to go back to something that they can read in order to hear sounds, don't you? You can't study the sounds that the letter C would represent if you can't go back to something that they can actually say the words and hear the sounds in them. So it's one of the reasons why it's even very important when you are doing shared reading that you point to the words with young kids. So they're actually saying, oh, those little black marks there are saying was, and then there's a space, and then the next word is going, and I'm pointing to the word going as I'm saying it. And if you've got a long, thin stick of some kind, that's great. But if you've got some at your arm, it will get in the way of other words, so you don't want to be using your arm. You actually want a long, thin stick. That's why the first big books that were published actually came with a long, thin pointer so that teachers would do it properly, because you're actually helping them to develop that one-to-one correspondence with what you say is what you are seeing. And that's how they build that knowledge of high-frequency words, isn't it? And that's why you start to see them spelt correctly in their writing, because they're making those associations when you're doing shared reading. or when you're doing shared and interactive writing, you say the word as you write it. So what we're doing is we're going back to something we can read, and we are listening. You can't look for a sound. I want you to make sure that you write yourself a big note about that. You cannot look for a sound. You can look for a letter, you can look for a spelling pattern, but you have to listen for a sound. Some teachers even have big ears that they make the kids to sort of think about this time we're listening, or big glasses that they make and say this time we're looking. There's a difference, isn't there? So we're listening in these words when we read them for any words that we hear with the k sound. And then you can start to make a list of those. And then you can start to say, what are we learning from this? And so what would your next step be once you've listed a lot of words that have a k sound? What would you do next?
Use them in your writing?
No, before that, we want to learn whatever we can about this.
The different sound.
Yeah, categorise.
Let's see.
Okay, so in each word, first of all, you need to identify which part of the word is the k sound and underline it or circle it, right? It might be a C, it might be a CK, it might be a K, it might be a CH, like in Christine, it might be a QU, as in Quentin, right? It might be just a Q, like in Qantas, right? So whatever it is, you're just identifying in this word, the k sound is here. And sometimes you'll have it a couple of times in a word, and we're only listening for the one sound. So if it was a word like circus, I would be underlining the C in the middle for k, but I wouldn't be underlining the first part, would I? Because that's a sound. So we're focusing on what we hear, the sounds. Now we can group them according to the different ways that that sound can be represented, because we're seeing what we can discover about this k sound. Like, is it more often this, or is it not very often that? If it's at the beginning of the word, if it's at the end of the word, what can I find out that will help me as a writer? So we're continuing our exploration, and we've got ones where it's C, where it's CK, where it's a K. You might even come across the word trekked, and it's the only word in the English language where it's a double K representing the k sound. But you never put down words that the kids can't tell you, because if they can't say the word, they can't hear the sound. So it's not for you to make some up. Gradually, of course, that list can be added to, which is why I always like to see them as something that you start off with but can grow. And what's the best way to have that in your classroom? You might have, a big book of blank pages and, one for each page for each of the 44 sounds, or you just might have it on a chart and they're all clipped together. Because if you spread them all around the room, you'll have them hanging in places where the kids can't read them, and that's useless. So just a big paper clip as you're developing these charts, because I can always go back when the kids say, oh, I found another one, and you can go back and add it. You also want to be able to make use of those when you and the kids are writing or interactive writing, or they're doing writing themselves. This is a resource, that I could go back to. If I'm writing a word and it has a k sound in it, I wonder if I can find anything on that chart that would help me with the word I'm writing. So think about where you'll have them, that they're usable for the kids. There's nothing worse than going to a classroom where I see things where the kids couldn't possibly make use of them or add to them or read them or anything. So they're just decorative and not useful that way. And frankly, they even block your sight in some classrooms, so they're not even good decoration. So think about they're a useful resource, and I can keep adding to them. I can go, and you want to demonstrate how you would go back and use them. So try and have them somewhere that's easy for you to locate. I think your work area where your kids are coming on the mat together is a really important place to have the sort of tools that you want to show them how they could make use of them. It's sort of where I want my word wall to be and so forth, where I want my big book easel and all the things that I'm going to make use of. That's basically how I explore any of the 44 sounds. So I don't know. I know I went into a lot more information than you might have asked for, but I think you really need to understand the whole picture.
Right. So the preps that can't read the words,
Yes.
how do they explore the sounds?
Well, that's why you can't do exploration of sounds until there's something that they can read. And that's why, and do you know, the real understanding of shared reading should mean that by, I was lucky enough to actually be taught all of this by the master himself, Don Holdaway. When he first came over from New Zealand in 1974, he came to where I was working, and we were the first people to learn from him about shared reading. So I really do know that the goal was, like with parents, when they read their kids' favourite books over and over, and if you've got any kids yourself, they want the same one every night, for 100 times. And you even try to leave out bits of it, and they know, don't they? You can't. They want their favourites. But by listening to their favourites over and over again, then they can pick them up and read them themselves. Even if they may not be able to point word by word, they know what they're saying and they can hear what's there. So Don Holdaway said, well, we must be able to do the same thing in a classroom if we had enlarged text to do that with. But it doesn't have to be a whole book. On the first day, I remember he taught us a poem. I love you, and you love me too. And that was it, And just from that, and he would write it on a chart. We could read it. Tomorrow we would read it again, and he would add another one. And within 10 days, we would know 10 songs or poems, or perhaps, a book that was, not a lot of different parts to it, so it was easy to read, or a nursery rhyme. And the goal was to very quickly get into their heads as many things that they could read as they possibly could. And of course, it's just through recognition of this poem at first. They're not actually necessarily, if you gave them something they'd never heard before or seen, they wouldn't be able to actually read the words. So it's not that true sense of reading and figuring out yourself. But they knew enough to be able to go back and reread and hear the word. So in other words, I'm not doing exploration. And besides, why would I be doing exploration of sounds that early in the year? I don't even know my kids yet. What if they all know all of that stuff? Then I'm wasting their time and mine. So I'm finding out a lot about my kids, but shared reading, I can start on day one. So the kids can go home that night and they all know the nursery rhyme, Mary Had a Little Lamb, and they would have a copy of it and they can read it. So there's no such time, Anne, as studying sounds if they can't read any words yet. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm sort of wondering if they can't do that, if they can't read yet, and it's all interconnected, when are they actually reading out of their little book box sort of thing?
Because I do want to start the notion. They come to school thinking, I'm going to learn to read today, right? My first day at school, I'm going to go home and know how to read. And that's why I'm always thinking about what will they be able to read on the first day of school. And I think nursery rhymes are ideal because, I've worked in schools where we've had no money to buy books, but we can easily make 25 copies of this nursery rhyme, and we'll even make it as a book. Page 1, Mary Had a Little Lamb. Page 2, its fleece was white as snow. Page 3. Now, which nursery rhymes might I choose? I try to choose these days in particular ones that will make sense to them. Like Mary Had a Little Lamb, there's too much in it that's not within their experiences. Lamb, fleece, white as snow, come on. So what might I choose? So I find things like Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a... Now, I can either decide to leave it as pail of water and tell them what a pail is, or change it to bucket. all right? It doesn't really matter either way. Of water, Jack fell down and broke his crown. I have to tell them what that means, don't I? All right, it means your head. This is your crown. Broke his crown, and Jill came tumbling after. So, there's nothing about that that's difficult to understand. In fact, it generates, if you treat it the right way, the kids say, well, why were they going up the hill for some water? And why did he fall down? And all sorts of things like that. So they really think about it as a real story. But I find that, we could actually do enough with nursery rhymes in the first few weeks if we've got nothing else. But I would also be, there are songs, simple songs to learn, and poems. They're the main ones that I would be making little books of. See, now I'm talking about stuff that I've actually done many times over, right? Because you don't want to go out and actually buy 25 copies of each of the, early reading books so the kids you could teach it and the kids could all have it. So this is a very practical way for me to have a book for each child to go home with on the first day of school. But I make them very special. For example, the book about Jack and Jill, those little pins that will allow things to turn around. Do you know what I mean? A little clip that you can do. Well, I would make Jill as a separate little cutout, right? And so on the page, Jill came tumbling after, I would put her onto that page with one of those little clips so the kids could actually turn it around as she came tumbling down the hill. Or on the page, Jack broke his crown, we would put a little Band-Aid strip. Now, I'm not a good illustrator, so it was just very simple illustrations, but the kids loved these books because they didn't look horrible. They loved the fact there was a Band-Aid even. They ended up being their favourite books for the whole year. And yet they were simple, cheap to make, something we could all do easily. And of course, everything has high-frequency words in it. So they were books we could go back to find the high-frequency words even. Anything we wanted to do when we were exploring particular sounds, when we got to that, we had this little group of books that we'd been adding to that they could read. Now, as a group of teachers, so 3 of you teach foundation, yeah? Is that right? Yep. Well, what we did was we just took it in turns, like I might make the little book of Jack and Jill, and we would talk in a little group about which nursery rhymes would we choose. And you might make the second one, and then the other person makes the third one. So we just sort of shared the job, and we might only just add one of those a week, so it wasn't overwhelming for us to do. But very quickly, the kids had a lot of little books in their reading box. But they also would have just, charts, a page of a poem or a nursery rhyme or a song that we would have the big book or the big chart version of. And then they would get a copy of it. Because what I'm thinking about is if I'm going to say we're going to have reading time and it's early in the school year, well, how much can I give them to read that will keep them busy reading for a little while? The first couple of days, they might only have one thing to read, but that's all right. They can just get in. It's the habit you're developing, isn't it? We read every day. There's something I can read. And everybody can read. So it's very, very positive. But then I also want to tell you about your shared reading material. Where do you keep that at the moment, all of you? Your big books, your school big books, where are they?
They're in like the foundation. We have them in an area just next door to my room.
Let me tell you why I'm asking the question. Most schools I've worked in, they get stored in the library, which is useless, so that's great, you haven't got them there. But they also tend to get stored in alphabetical order of the title. And that's not what you should be looking at. What's suitable for preps, what's suitable for grade 1, what's suitable for grade 2, because, shared reading is meant to be what the kids can join in with. So it sounds like you're on the ball there. But even then, what I would use at the start of a foundation year is quite different to what I might use at the end of a foundation year, isn't it? So I'm even looking at my books as a foundation year and saying, what would be really easy to read the kids could join in with in the first couple of weeks. For example, I don't know, what are you reading there at the moment in your foundation year? What's your shared reading book? Any one of you, they don't all have to be the same.
Mrs.
Wishy-washy, absolutely ideal for the start of the foundation year, isn't it? All right. Perhaps Hattie and the Fox is a little bit further along the line, and something else I know by the end of the year they would cope with it much more. So each of you is also thinking about what's most suitable for now. So if I'm using Mrs. Wishy-washy, I might really say, well, you know what, I should at least make sure that I've got 6 copies of the small book of Mrs. Wishy-washy, because I know that is so suitable for this age group right now. And so you actually make some choices about which are the best books for you to get some small copies of when you've got the money to do so. And even when you're buying, because some of the big books you just should be throwing away, frankly. They're not even really suitable for shared reading, right? Or perhaps they should be in someone else's classroom because they're not suitable for your kids. And even, I might have at the beginning of my year 1 year, what was at the end, being used at the end of the prep year, the foundation year, the year before. But at the start of grade 1, I need them here, right? So you're thinking about where are they most useful and which are the best ones to get some multiple copies of. Now, that's part of the answer to your question about what have they got in their little reading boxes. If we've been using Mrs. Wishy-washy, and at least some of the kids could have a copy of the book in their box, right? So I'm thinking about, as we what we're gradually introducing to the kids that they can read, that they can add to their reading box, that they can stay occupied with reading for longer and longer periods of time. Because, and that's why I have to say that it's interesting. I work at a school, 95% of the parents are unemployed. And so they are a very disadvantaged school. They're in a little pocket. The majority of the kids who've come to school have not had books of their own. They haven't been to the library. They've not been read to, et cetera, et cetera. So, they're starting off. They haven't had parents reading to them The Very Hungry Caterpillar, The Gruffalo, The Green Sheep. Right now, I went up to a bookshop yesterday and bought all those books for a friend's daughter who's just had a baby, right? Because we know they're the sorts of books you read. They want them over and over again from the time they're babies till when they go to school. I find that the kids I'm talking about have actually missed that experience. So it's absolutely essential that those books are in every prep and grade 1 classroom so that you can read them to the kids over and over and over, just like parents do, not once and then read a different one the next day, but rereading and rereading, because that's how those kids learned to read before they came to school, wasn't it? Now, they've missed that experience. I don't know about your kids. Have some of them missed that experience?
Yes,
some, yeah. So make sure they now get it, all right, because it's essential. So, again, when I'm thinking about my money, and I know we're covering a lot of issues here that may not necessarily be your questions, but they all go together, they're what affect kids' writing and reading. The interesting thing about those books is, The Very Hungry Caterpillar is actually 32 pages.
Yeah.
And a child who's heard that book even 4 or 5 times can sit there and read that book. And it takes them quite a while. Whereas a little 8-page book, Nothing much in it anyway, nothing to think about, nothing to look at and talk about the pictures. I'm done.
Yeah.
Whereas the Very Hungry Caterpillar, they actually get a lot more repetition. It's a real story. You want to read it again. So again, thinking carefully about the advantage of having some of those richer books in your classroom, as well as the little simple nursery rhyme. And of course, some of the 8-page books are worth reading. Some of them are terrible. So it's that what you've got as a resource and how you use it makes a big difference to all the things we're talking about with learning about letters and sounds. Does that make sense to you? In prep in grade 1, we made sure there were multiple copies of these books. And do you know where I learned that? I was watching a child in preps, and she had a little group of kids around her, and she was reading to them the wrong book. Do you know the wrong book? It is absolutely precious. If you don't know the wrong book, if there's a copy of it in your school, you all have to look at it and read it. All right, take it to your next meeting. And she had read it, it had been read to them lots of times, so she knew how to read that book. So she's got them all there and she's reading. And I thought that should be in her book box. She's able to read that, and not in the true sense of if you come to a word you don't know, you can figure it out type reading. But that's the book box has to have in it stuff that they can practice reading with, right? And it's a whole issue about, yes, the more you read, the better your reading becomes. But if there's stuff in your book box that you can't read, that's too hard for you to read or you're not familiar with, then that won't help you at all. So more of what they've had a lot of experience with at those age groups. And then, of course, you're also thinking about the exact right book that this child needs. When I confer with them, I know that if I gave them this, it will be that little bit stretched that they can read something that's got something that they don't know and they can start to work out what it is. But they know enough words to work it out. So it's a very scientific thing, isn't it? Working out what to give children to read next, which is why they don't make the selection, I do, because it's so scientific about knowing what they need next. It's probably the most important decision I'm making each day. Now, all of that in relation to your question about how do you learn about sounds, if I haven't got all of that other stuff going, I can't go back and say, now let's listen for words that have the k sound. And besides, because I've been building in all that great foundation of reading to the kids and them, memorise type reading of their own, they all feel like we're all readers, we've got the whole routine going and we're ready to go on and actually learn quite specific things. But it's sort of like getting that all rich foundation in first. And of course, you can't do any group work until the kids are reading books. You could have conferences with them and start to figure out what different kids need. That you'd say, oh, that kid are not, they're not doing any self-correcting. I need to pull them together and teach them how to do that. So it all starts off from having the right sort of foundation going. So let's go back to your questions. I'm sorry, here we are. We've been at it for an hour and I probably have only answered 2 of your questions.
Who's the best to go to for a big books, best supply, do you think?
Oh, golly, that's the toughest thing these days. I mean, it's tragic. They're not even being produced anymore.
They're not very big anymore either.
No, they're wrong. The publishers now have got no idea what they're supposed to be doing. Probably what you've got and bought a long time ago are going to be the best ones you've got. I can remember when Don Holdaway first came over and taught us about shared reading, there were no big books published. None, right? The first of them were published in the 1970s by Scholastic. They were actually called Ashton Scholastic in those days. And I remember the first ones that were published. And as I say, they came with a pointer. But what Don and his co-worker were doing, they were making their own. And again, they were just using things like the traditional stories, the, 3 billy goats gruff, or, the 3 little pigs. There's so many of them that are ideal, aren't they? Old MacDonald had a farm, a song like that. And they didn't have to do the illustrations. The kids can do the illustrations. All you need is the blank pages, put them together, teach them. If you've got, I think that it's the kids doing the illustrations means they have to think about what needs to be illustrated on this page. If it's Old MacDonald had a cow, they've got to draw a picture of a cow, don't they? So it's sort of a really good comprehension activity as well. But, no matter what, they were just making their own big books. That meant they were making them the right size. The print was the right size. Because, you can buy a big book of The Very Hungry Caterpillar and it's got such a tiny print that you can't use it for shared reading. But look, I tell you what I found was the Joy Cowley books are still available from a couple of places, and you can just find them online. But if you go back to Joy's original books like Mrs. Wishy Washy and You, My Mother, and, there's several of them that are really good, and you can still buy them and you can still buy the small books of them, then, for the first year, foundation year, they're ideal. But even, Greedy Cat, there was a series of some big books of those stories which were great for grade 1. I don't think you can even buy them anymore. So, but I tell you what, I do have a list of what I have found as suitable. And, like Farmer Duck or The Pigs Can Fly, there's a few of them around. So I'll send you a list of what I found was worth getting. And I really tried to track them down in a lot of places. Well, I think you have to be very careful of the word test. So, for example, there's one of my goddaughter's sons is in grade 3. And so what we did last week was check which high frequency words he knew. Now, interestingly enough, we actually asked him, first of all, to write down the ones he thought he knew, right? And I tell you what, if they can do that, they really know the word. They even are aware of what are the high frequency words and can recall. And he made a list of about 30 that he realised were high frequency words and he could remember them and he wrote them down. And then we checked him on others, and it was a checking, not a test. And who are we checking that for? For him to know which ones did he know, and therefore which ones would he still need to learn. And for him in grade 3, as soon as possible. For your grade 2 teachers, that's the same thing. By now, they really should know them. But you know what? The last 2 years it's not been normal, right? So you need to check for them which ones they know so that you'll see which ones as a class perhaps you all need to spend some time on, even if some of the kids know them. This discussion when you're learning a word is still rich for everybody. And which ones you don't need to worry about because most of the kids know them, but individual children might also know, well, I also need to learn blah, blah, blah. So it's the word test that's bad, not the checking. Does that make sense? Don't ever use the word test. It's not a test. It's to find out which ones they know, and for you and for them to be aware of that so that you know which ones to deal with.
Okay, brilliant.
Now, have you got a copy of the booklet, How to Teach High Frequency Words? If you think there's something not clear or missing in it, you let me know because I can make whatever changes to that. You'll be my good feedback. Everything I was talking about in foundation, the whole theory behind what I was saying applies to every age group. doesn't it? I wasn't just talking about foundation. I was talking about what you need to do, whether it's year 9 or not. It's still the same principle, isn't it? Okay. All right. So what's the question?
So the question is this: should we be focusing on high frequency words that can be used to write simple sentences? Like, I can see that, because the problem, Di, is we found last week in foundation, the kids had a wonderful language experience, and when they started to write, then they started writing, they were talking in a rich language, great vocab, and all of a sudden they said, I can see the cow, I can see the farm, because, we taught them, those high frequency words. So what do you think about that?
So there are a number of things that influence what children do as writers. And the main influence is what we model. So when I'm modelling writing for young children, and that means foundation onwards, I have to make sure that I don't just model writing one sentence, for example, and I don't just model writing simple sentences. And that if I want them to write more than I can see the cow, then my writing needs to be, yesterday we went to the farm and we saw, in other words, I have to write it like I'm telling a story, don't I? You don't find writing in a book, I can see a cow, unless it's actually one of those 8-page books that's written for quite the purpose, which often tend to be not very good, right? But it might be, I can see a cow, I can see a dog, whatever, because it's going to be easy to read. But that's not what you want. And that's the other thing that influences their writing, by the way, which is another reason why we want to be using richer picture books like The Very Hungry Caterpillar for their reading. It's very common for teachers to write language experience sentences using those very simple sentence structures, or only writing one sentence. But if you write that as your model, that's what the kids will write when it comes to writing. And certainly, I'm been in classrooms where the kids' writing is, they have to just, start with the sentence, I can see, and then they have to fill in the rest of it. And that's called writing. Well, it's not, is it? But, when I'm doing interactive or shared writing, what we write at that time will influence what kids do. Even what you give them to write with. If you give them one piece of paper, they will do one picture and write one sentence. If you staple a number of pieces of paper together, they write lots of pages. Have you noticed that? So I always would have in my writing area, tools for writing might be, little cut up pages all stapled together with even some little design on the first page looking like the cover. So they would write a book rather than thinking I'm just going to write a sentence and then I'm done. So you have to tell me, why do you think your kids are only writing something simple, even though you want them to write more? Why do you think that's happening? What are you modelling for them as writing? What do you think?
For some of them, their writing is very simple from the model, because the model is simple.
Because the model is simple, yeah. And see how you get over that. And, for example, you should always be studying something in your classroom. Let's say it's just learning about snails, all right? Then, as an observation, we could be learning about snails, and we might, and at the same time, I would make sure I'm reading to them some non-fiction books. There's lots for young kids these days, and we actually talk about how these non-fiction books work. Like if there's a drawing, it usually has a label, right? So it was a snail, and we wanted to tell people and we might even put a subheading for this chapter, what snails look like. So here I'm modelling. We're going to write this together. Our first heading is what snails look like. And the kids tell me what they observe about what snails look like, and we write that down, and then we do a diagram of a snail and label the parts of the body. And it might just be shell, and they might not know what this bit's called. So I might have to tell them that's called their, we could just say feeler if you like, couldn't we? If there's some bits we don't know, as a teacher, I could find out and read it to them so that we would know what information we're going to put in our book. So a whole lots of different things can come up depending on what we write. If we only write about experiences like yesterday, we went to the farm and we saw a cow, then that's what their writing is going to be like. So I actually found writing a lot more non-fiction as we were learning about stuff. And tomorrow we might say, what snails eat? And then, you know, we write down something about that and the picture that goes with it. I start off doing a lot of modelling of what the picture might look like, but then I will pass that over to the kids, because if we're reading non-fiction books, they quickly pick up. It will have labels and captions and whatever, and they add those sorts of things to their drawings. Now, if I'm doing that, I'm not going to waste it. This is our reading material now, isn't it? So today we go back and we reread. Snails don't have feet. Snails have a shell, whatever it is, okay? Tomorrow, snails eat leaves, but we also go back then and read page 1 and page 2. So each day that we add a page about what we're learning about snails, but then we will go back and read all of those pages as we add them. So it's like I never think about print without making use of a lot of it. Now, what else can I do with that print? We could go back and find high frequency words that we might want to learn. We can do some sound explorations from what we've written. We can take a word and do some onset rhyme work with it. I could actually, page 1, whatever we wrote, I could write a sentence strip with that, cut it up into words. And the kids who need it, they could be working in a little group over here, putting that back together. I put those little words into an envelope with the sentence on the front of it, and gradually I'm building up a whole lot of these that's additional reading kids can do. So do you see what I'm doing? I'm saying, how do kids learn to read and write? How do I actually help them learn words, sounds, spelling patterns, sentence structure? But we do it by doing some combined writing together. That might be me writing, or I could get them involved where we're doing interactive writing. And then we make use of what we're writing. So I can send you an article about how that all works if you like. But is that sort of idea useful for you to think about what you do? In other words, if I want kids to write different kinds of stuff, I have to write different kinds of stuff with them, don't I? And then if I'm going to do that, how do I actually turn it into something useful rather than just be a model of writing? You do a lot of work that you don't make enough use of. Would you agree?
Yes.
Yes. Save yourself a lot of time if you go back and reuse that print you've already got. But, you know, the kids develop so quickly as readers and writers through that sort of work.
If you were to run a 2-hour literacy block, what would that look like for you?
Well, first of all, I would be very wary about talking about 2 hours, and I'll tell you why. An enormous amount of language learning really should be happening when you are doing what you might call your investigations or whatever other stuff you're studying. And I have 2 concerns about that. One is, if that happens, then it means that the kids will actually be getting access to lots of different kinds of language that they might find if you're just doing it during a literacy block. The other is, I know that one of the most important things to help children's reading and writing is their world knowledge. You cannot write about things you don't know about. you cannot read stuff with understanding if you don't know much about it. So I get worried that not enough time is left in the day for learning all kinds of things about the world in sciences and history and, you know, what I mean. So what are you studying at the moment? Do you do it in terms of integrated study topics, or what do you tend to do?
We do units of inquiry.
Yep.
So
okay.
at the moment, the kids are looking at knowing themselves and their well-being and how to be balanced and with their health.
Right. In what grade? That's in grade 1
and 2.
Okay. All right. Make sure when you look at your year's plan that you're actually building in a lot of really interesting world knowledge stuff. I can tell you, even if you just decide to read a non-fiction book or chapter, you know, picture book or whatever, but non-fiction to your kids every day, you will improve their reading and writing out of sight, because you need to build their world knowledge. Now, I'll bet your kids have a limited world knowledge. Yes? What are you going to do about it? You've got to read to them. And when you do, you notice they will interrupt you and ask you lots of questions, because stuff like that really stimulates their thinking. And then you're giving them models of all different kinds of things. You're building their vocabulary, you're building their world knowledge that they bring to what they're reading. You're introducing to all different kinds of writing and reading. And you've left enough time in the day to do it. I hope they're learning songs every week.
1 hour.
Right. And then you've got all your physical things. You've got to get out there and do physical activities as well and whatever. All of these things are a very important part of a child's development, aren't they? Yeah. So 2 hours is a long time. Make sure you really, especially because some of the stuff you're doing should actually be happening in other subject areas anyway. So what's important for me to do, though, if I think about reading, it's essential I read to them every day, isn't it? Yep, you know that. What I choose to read is very important. Over the year, am I reading a balance of fiction and non-fiction? Am I reading different authors with different kinds of art? You know, I have to be very careful. Also, for all of you, because of the age group you teach, you must reread their favourites many times. Not a new thing all the time, but rereading favourites, very important. I need to do shared reading every day, don't I? Right? Proper shared reading. I need to do independent reading, absolutely. They need time for that. And only after a few weeks of independent reading, perhaps by now, you could start to have conferences with your children and start to find out what they can do and what they're having trouble with as readers. And of course, this is going to be linked to what you're teaching in comprehension, in fluency, in phonics, whatever. What are they doing? And therefore, what am I finding out that I could form some groups for? So I don't even use the term guided reading anymore, because I don't think anyone really knows what it's meant to be. And I see it being done in a fixed way all the time. This is this guided reading group and this is this guided reading group. Really, it's just, it makes common sense that when you find kids who've got the same need, you pull them together and you deal with it together. Does that make sense? So by now, I should be knowing enough about my kids to start to do some group work. Because also, when I'm doing group work, the kids have to be able to go on with things that are useful and that they will be able to stay occupied on. All right, so that's another reason why I don't start at the beginning of the year. Do you know, the interesting thing is, even what you're planning your small groups to be, why do I have to have a different group every day? If I found out that 4 of you needed help to, that you don't actually look at each part of the word when you're saying it. You only look at the first letter. And so I need to help you do more than that. I'm not just going to do it today, but I'm better off to do it today and tomorrow and the day after, because then I feel like you've really got it. And then I don't need to work with you again on that. And now you're no longer a group. So I think sometimes in teaching we get tied up with this plans that I must see different children every day, and that's not necessarily the best way for learning to occur. But I know that I will have some group work time taking place, and I might even have some, I'm definitely going to have some individual time, because during independent reading, I'm conferring with kids. And when I confer, that's when teachable moments also come up, don't they? So sometimes a conference turns into 10 minutes because I actually do some on-the-spot teaching. Makes sense. So they're the sorts of things I know I need to do. And it's the same with writing, isn't it? I need to model writing. We need to do some together. They need to do some independently, and I confer. I might have some group work. And of course, in both reading and writing, there's so many strands to it, aren't there? You know, in writing, it could be, for example, by grade 2, if they're writing stories, do they understand how a good story works? You know, that it's about characters and there's a plot and a setting. Whereas with, back down in your foundation, you just want the kids to be feeling confident about writing and having a go and writing, lots of different things. And there's a spelling within at every age group where what they're doing in writing, what work you do in spelling. There's going to be some whole class work, and you may need to do some, individual or small group work. So I'm sort of thinking about what do I need to teach and what's the best way to do it, rather than I have a fixed structure all the time. Now, does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
We got off onto a lot of subjects other than just what questions you might have about spelling. Wow. All right. But I hope it's been of value. You have to watch me. I will go off onto big picture stuff because I want to have this context in which these things should be happening. They don't just happen in isolation.
So we'd like to say amazing to listen to you. You've answered a lot of questions, but I think you've actually posed a lot more for us, which we would love to learn more about. And the big picture is what we want to get. So thank you very much. And hopefully we look forward to hearing a lot more from you.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Q Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Q can help you and your school, visit qlearning.com.au. And you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.